This episode is brought to you by Green Skies Analytics, an audit analytics service provider that works with internal audit departments that have data analysts and are still frustrated with trying to make analytics actually work, aren't getting the expected ROI, who can't break through the communication barrier between the analysts and the audit team, and those that need experienced direction for an audit analytics strategy and process. Those that feel like they've wasted time and money on trainings, aren't getting the value they want, not prioritizing the highest risk areas for the organizations, or have projects that seemingly never get completed. Do you deal with any of that? If you do, go to the show notes of this episode and click the Green Skies Analytics link, or go to greenskiesanalytics.com to schedule a call and understand how Green Skies Analytics makes analytics actually work for internal audit.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Audit Podcast. I'm your host, Trent Russell, and today we have a lot of different guests, whereas we usually just have one. Today we have sort of a best of the Audit Podcast, except the goal in the podcast for a lot of our guests is to get them to tell us how to actually do whatever it is that they are talking about doing. So thought leadership is great, and we need that for sure, but then also tell us exactly how to do it. That's a big point that we try to make. I often tell guests kind of in the pre-recording call that we have together, my favorite follow-up question is how? And so when someone says, you should do X, Y, Z, we go, great. How do you do that? And so we thought, rather than doing necessarily just a best of episode, we would do a best of the how-tos. And so that's what all of our guests, this episode and the following, are where they give practical how-to advice on how to do whatever it is that they know how to do. So with that said, here we go. First up, we have Melissa Pici. She is the Senior IT Audit Manager at Cineverse, and she is going to talk us through how to use college courses, obviously on how to learn topics, but then also how to use college courses to get CPEs, which I think is very, very valuable. One of the few people I know that have talked on this topic. And so with that, here's Melissa.
I love taking college courses instead of necessarily sometimes going to conferences, especially at the local college level, which is going to actually lead right into what I'm going to talk about in a little bit. At the local college level, it's about $300 to take a 3-credit course, and I'm actually learning hands-on information that I can do. That's why I'm taking, now I'm working on my cybersecurity degree, because if I'm going to do the classes, I may as well get the degree too.
Sure.
But I get 15 CPE out of it. So when you're looking at the return on investment, it's huge. And so anytime my guys are asking like, well, what do we do for CPEs? I'm like, look, go find a topic. Whether maybe it's you want to dig further into operating system security, or you want to do something else, go to your local college, grab a $300 class, 15 CPE. We're supposed to have, I think, 40 a year for our certifications. And now you've gained a valuable skill and you've managed to get CPE all in one shot. And so I think it's a great way of doing that. I've been doing it that way for years.
Next, we have Charlie Page. He's the Associate Director of Internal Audit at Verizon, and Charlie's going to talk us through how to develop SQL skills. So for those that don't know, SQL is basically this language you use to communicate with a database so that you can actually pull the data out of the database, kind of a foundational element for data analysts. And so Charlie talks us through how to do that.
And at first, when we were on this journey, I thought, is this a use it or lose it type of skill? Like, I learned this. I didn't do an audit with data for a few quarters, just the way you work. But I quickly learned that's not the case at all. Like, I can't imagine an audit that I'm not using my SQL skills to analyze something, right? Just the general planning, right? You can learn things and you're immediately right away getting results. So it's helping us plan and become much more strategic. An example, you could think, we're going to look at all these different SKUs, right? We're going to look at this product, all these different SKUs. But then you analyze it yourself and planning. You know what? 90% of it's these 2 SKUs. Do we care about these other SKUs? No. Okay, so we don't need to do walkthroughs and all these other things if we think the risk is here, right? And so you can save your time if you really know, how to access this data faster.
Next up, we have Daniel, the Bedford's guru, McCarville, on the show. He's the audit analytics lead at Crane, and he's going to talk to us about Bedford's and how to use Bedford's and do that first digit analysis. So for those that aren't familiar, I'm not going to go into more detail because Daniel does an extremely good job of doing that. But with that said, here's Daniel on how to do a Bedford's analysis.
In Bedford's law, we're looking at the distribution of the digits at the beginning of some data, right? In this data, this came from FinCEN. If you remember, several years ago, there was a very well-known disclosure of some banking data that was banks reporting suspicious transactions to the federal government, United States federal government, in case there's anyone who's outside of the United States. So looking at this data, we expect there to be unusual things in it. We're looking at the dollar value of transactions that banks believe are suspicious. Probably the most common way to approach Bedford's Law is the first digit test, where you just look at this first single digit. And that's what I've got here. So when we look at all of this data from all of these different banks, all of these different countries, does it follow Bedford's Law? This is what I think most people do. This is the traditional way to do it. So we can see, most digits are pretty close. 7 and 8 are too low. We can click on the 8. I built all this out in Power BI. We could use any tool that we wanted. I like the visual aspect. So, we see the 8s are too low. We could scroll through it and look for something interesting. The 9s are too high. We could scroll through the 9s and look for something interesting, right? A slightly more sophisticated version would be to use the Z-score for each digit. And then the Z-score would sort of prove out, oh, this digit really is too high or too low. So this is the traditional, I think, common way of approaching Bedford's Law.
Can you, while you're in here, for those that are still like, what is he talking about, this first digit thing? Can you show in the data what you're talking about? So it's numbers that start with the number 8. That's the one example. Numbers that start with the number 9. That was the other example. I found that to be helpful.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So when we look at the value of the transactions, so my first transaction here, that looks like it's about 1.6 million. Well, the first digit is 1. It starts with a 1.
So you plot the 1 out. So you say 1. We're going to plot that.
Absolutely. Second one is 50,000. Well, it starts with a 5.
Plot the 5.
Yeah, plot the 5. And a 5 could be 50,000, could be 5 million, could be 5 cents.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the first digit it could be negative 5 cents, actually. So long as the first thing that's not a 0 is a 5, we're going to call it a 5.
Okay.
And that's part of the thing that makes Bedford's Law, in some sense, almost mystically unintuitive. Who cares what the first digit is, right?
Yeah.
Except that it turns out it does matter. There is a matter.
And so what we're looking at here then is on your 1, we look at the 1 where it says 30%. 30% of the population that we were just looking at starts with the number 1.
Yep. And so what I've got here is a blue line, which indicates what Bedford's Law expects. Just a formula based on these guys who observed that some of the pages in their books are used too often, right? So we're expecting 30.1% of all of our records, of all of these transactions, to start with the number 1. In reality, 29.7% start with 1. You could say that's pretty close. There are a lot of transactions, so we might not be, we might want to be very sensitive to that difference. We definitely noticed the 8 more, though. We were expecting 5.1%, actually got 4.2%, almost a whole percentage point off. Tells us maybe there's some data that should have been down here in 8 or in 7 that now got shifted somewhere else, like the 9. And so the normal way to do this would be to say, hey, my 9 is too high. I click on it, I sort through it, and I look for something. Here's the upgrade, though. Here's what a more modern approach would be like. And this is what I did with my test scores, too. Because I don't actually think, for the most part, that people really care necessarily that the 9 is too high. I think a lot of times what people want to do is they want to find some route that's really off the rails. Is there a bank that's going crazy? Is there a certain country? Is there a certain date? So what I did here is I said, let's do Bedford's Law once for each bank receiving funds in this data. So I'm going to look for banks that are receiving suspicious dollar amounts and their transactions don't follow Bedford's Law. And one thing I like about Power BI, you can do this in Tableau, right, is I can make this interactive. We could just pick a bank from the list. It would filter automatically. There's a whole bunch of these different scores you can calculate. I think the most common one is probably chi-square. I'm a big fan of the D-score. Nick Green talks day and night about his MAD score. Doesn't matter which score we use. Just know that there's some out there. And so what I plotted here is the dollar amount of all the transactions, and then up and down, how close are you to Bedford's law? If you're way up here at the top, you don't follow Bedford's law at all. So what we see is right off the bat, the bank, well, actually, this looks like it's a country, United Emirates. Gosh, I can't even say the name of this country, United Arab Emirates. So this particular bank, totally far away from Bedford's law.
Right.
We click on it, and in fact, what we see is 25% of their transactions start in 9. I mean, look how fast that was. We put it on the scatter plot. Immediately could see which bank was the irregular bank. And I'll tell you, this pattern here, this is the classic example we look for people avoiding some kind of control. In truth, what there is here is there's a law that says if you're sending, I think it's more than $10,000 or $10,000 or more, you have to report that to the federal government.
Right.
So when you see too many transactions starting with 9, what are they doing? Well, they're coming just underneath that limit. Could not be a more picturesque example of somebody avoiding a control and how we find it in Bedford's law. And it's so much easier when we break it down into smaller groups instead of trying to look at the whole thing.
Next, we have Clarissa Lucas. She is the SVP of Internal Audit at Citi, where she is implementing auditing with agility, which makes a ton of sense as she literally wrote the book Beyond Agile Auditing. And she's going to talk to us about how to get clean data faster.
Let's talk about something a little near and dear to your heart about analytics.
Okay.
I think another mindset shift that we need to be thinking through is how we approach things like analytics. Let me explain. So through both my professional experiences as a practicing audit leader and discussions with people at other organizations, it's not just me. I've confirmed. Always try to make sure, is it a user error or is it something bigger than that?
Yeah.
Probably part user error, but I'm not the only one with it. But we struggle with some competing priorities. So we want to deliver data-driven insights. Absolutely. We also want to deliver things faster. And a lot of times, some people are blessed with data that is very easy to get to. It's very clean. It's very workable. That's usually not what I run into.
Yeah.
So it takes a lot of time to get the data in a clean, usable format. So a lot of times we have to pick. We've got audits that are projects and we have a start date, we have a targeted end date, a budget, and then we want to try to deliver insights through data, which typically blows up those time and calendar budget. So usually we have to pick. Do you want data-driven insights or do you want your results fast?
Yeah.
Not both. So what we're trying to shift our mindset and change the way we think about these things and kind of separate the analytics from the project, the audit project, and think about it as its own product. Okay. So like I mentioned, the projects are very, you have a start date, you have an end date, you've got a budget that you're working with. It has a start and an end. A product has more of a life. So you're going to ideate, figure out what it is you're trying to do, you create it, you maintain it. Eventually you may retire it, but it's not like we're going to have this product for a year or 6 weeks. It's when it's run its useful life and we can't maintain it anymore, or it's no longer adding value, then we can retire it and sunset it. So 2 different mindsets. And another thing that I'm borrowing from the IT world, they figured a lot of stuff out. So I really don't invent anything new. Yeah. It's more like, these guys figure it out. So let's apply this to audit.
Lastly, we have Chris Chin. He is a leadership and communications coach for data and tech folks. He runs The Hidden Speaker, so check him out on LinkedIn also. And Chris is going to talk to us about how to create clarity with data visualizations, which is a critically important skill. So to wrap up the show, here is Chris Chin.
One practical takeaway would be think about one thing you can take away from your visualization. My belief is that it's not about the more things you add to the visual, it's about what you can take away that can enhance it. Maximize what you already have and take away what doesn't serve the purpose of the visual. I was working, for example, with a client on some data visualizations for their quarterly presentation. And they were, to a lot of things we've been saying, they were very complicated. They had a lot of information. And I said, think about one thing you can take away from this visual to make it more effective. He thought about it for a while. And he said, well, I could take away some color, perhaps. Every single bar in his bar chart was a different color. And I said, does it need to be that way? He said, I guess it doesn't really need to be that way. It just kind of was that way because the tool, that was the default color palette. The tool, just a different color for every bar. And I said, well, you could get away with just making them the same color, just all blue, for example. And you would lose no information. In fact, it probably would be more clear because now we're not distracted looking at all the different colors. Another recommendation that I gave to him for a different chart, I said, look at this dual axis chart, being a chart with some bars and some lines simultaneously, all in one place. And I said, what is something you could take away from this one chart? And he thought about it for a little bit. And he said, well, I guess I could take away the line. And I said, yes, if you take away the line and you just have the bars there, there's one message for the viewer to see. I typically strongly dislike dual axis charts, perhaps even more than pie charts, because there's just often so much going on in that. You have two y-axes with different scales, bars on one side, lines on the other, and it's very hard for typically non-technical audiences to understand what's going on. It's better often, in my opinion, and what I've seen for a lot of the clients I work with, a lot more effective for their audiences, to separate it out. One chart for the bar data that you're trying to visualize, one chart for the line data. You can superimpose them vertically or horizontally, so it's easy to see the trends side by side. And it's instantly easy to understand because you chunk out the information, so it's easy to digest.
Yeah. You mentioned the default, like he said, oh, I just stuck to those colors because that was the default. Have you ever seen where the default, like let's just stick with Excel, where whatever the default is in Excel, you go, yep, that looks good?
I would say the white background that they have for the charts typically is a good default. Other than that, I usually recommend that people pay attention to those defaults.
Yeah.
And make sure that everything that's present on your visual, you purposefully chose. It was just not left there by the tool. But for the font, for the color, the title, make sure you have chosen everything and that it all has its place in the message you want to tell.
Yeah, I agree. The default is always terrible. Hey everyone, thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Audit Podcast. Whatever platform you're listening on right now, I'm sure there's a subscribe button somewhere, so please hit the subscribe button there. If you're listening through iTunes or Spotify, feel free to go give us that 5-star rating. It only took me about 16 seconds to give myself a 5-star review, and it really helps to get future guests to come on the show, so we'd really appreciate that. Lastly, be sure to check out the show notes and follow us on all our social media channels on Instagram, on LinkedIn, and on TikTok. Also, if interested, please sign up for our weekly newsletter from the Audit Podcast. Thank you all. Have a great one.